Welcome back from lunch. You look happier. No, you look the same. Welcome back, which is wonderful. Welcome back. We're excited to begin our panel now on trauma and recovery in community and church settings. As we said before, we're really intent on this symposium having practical applications, and we really, as Fuller Seminary, are trying to be good neighbors. The truth is, if we confess, we've not always been great neighbors. And we can confess that, but we can also say we're trying to be better neighbors. And so we're very thankful for our neighbors, many of who are presented right here at this panel. And we want to find ways to engage with the community, give back to the community, to learn from the community, and to grow in those relationships. So I do want to remind you, right after this panel, we'll have a short 15-minute break, and then we will have our second plenary session with Dr. Shelley Rambo, Re-engaging Your Inner Authority, Rebuilding Spiritual Trust through the writings of Julian of Norwich. And now I'm going to turn this over to Dr. Fort.
Hello. Third time's a charm. It's good to see everyone. Welcome back. I'm so glad to have you. For those of you who are here with us this morning, welcome. Thank you for staying with us throughout the day. We are grateful to have your presence here. I said earlier that I was very hopeful that you were engaging with us actively and not only passively. It's something I ask for from my students in the classroom, that you're not only consuming the things that I'm saying and hoping that they're coming from God, but also that you are engaging and discerning what you're hearing and coming up with questions. This time that we have here is a panel that is going to draw on the wisdom of a wealth of different people. The whole panel does not know each other. This is our first time being introduced. And it's a chance for us to be able to engage with this theme about trauma broadly and thinking about all the different implications that trauma might have for us in our communities, in our classrooms, in our clinics, and broadly in various other settings as well, especially in the church. And so as we do that, I'm going to say a little bit about our panelists and then ask them to introduce themselves. I have a few questions to get us started, but really the goal of our time for the next hour and 5 minutes is to hear what you all want to talk about connected to these themes based on who we have here in the room. So I'll say a few things to get us started, and we'll move from there. I'll start with a brief introduction of myself. I didn't say much about myself earlier, so my name is Christin Fort, and I'm a psychologist who's a graduate here of our program in the School of Psychology. I am delighted that I had the privilege of studying psychology and theology here at Fuller, and both of those things are near and dear to my heart. I'm an African-American woman of enslaved descent, and I was raised in a home where ministry was very prominent. That is part of why these topics matter so much to me, not only professionally, but personally. Growing up in a family where the church mattered greatly to my home and my household, and I bring that into my work. I'm also a practicing psychologist, which means I love doing therapy as well. I've been a therapist for the last 13 or 14 years, and it's really meaningful to me to think about how these ideas actually take shape in clinical practice, as well as in the classroom and in the community. So that's some of what I bring with me, some intersectional identities that I bring with me to this space. Joining me as well, we also have a number of other special guests. One of them is Rosa, who is here with us today. Rosa, I'm so glad that you're here. I'll have you say something about yourself in just a moment. But Rosa describes herself as a Salvadorian daughter of immigrants who was raised here. And so much of what she does as a bivocational pastor has to do with caring for the spiritual formation as well as the practical needs of the community in church and non-church settings. I'll let her say more about that in just a moment. We also have with us Pastora Inés Velásquez-McBryde, who received her MDiv here from Fuller, and Rosa also got her degree from Fuller as well. Inés is a pastor, a preacher, a reconciler, and a speaker. She is the lead pastor of the Church We Hope For here in the area, a multi-ethnic church in Pasadena, California. I encourage you to check it out online or in person if you get a chance. We also have here with us Dr. Luann Pannell, also a graduate of our program here in the School of Clinical Psychology. I first met Luann, fun fact, when I was a second-year doctoral student, trying to get to know people who survived the program. And that was my first moment with her and her wonderful late husband, having a chance to see people who made it through the program in one piece. who lived to tell the tale. It was a beautiful thing going to my first alumni event with her. Dr. Luann Pannell is the CEO at Exceptional Edge Consulting and the Director of Instructional Design and Academic Innovation for the Policing Leadership Academy at the University of Chicago Crime Lab. You can see that her work intersects with clinical psychology and forensic psychology and community psychology and other things that she can get into in a few moments when she describes herself. But she brings her integrative training here at Fuller into her work with police officers and the community and training there. And as an African-American woman, that matters greatly to me. I feel grateful for you and for your work. We also have here with us Dr. Kate Wiebe, one of our newest faculty members here in the School of Psychology and Marriage and Family Therapy. This is Dr. Wiebe's first month working at Fuller full-time, so we're delighted and grateful that she agreed to join us so soon. Dr. Kate Wiebe is amazing on so many different levels. One of them is that she brings her experience as both a licensed clinical psychologist and her PhD in theology as well, along with her MDiv and all the other degrees that she has, to us here at Fuller, bringing her experience both as a pastor and also as a licensed psychologist and organizational consultant here in Pasadena. She's done so many things, including serving as the founder of the Institute for Collective Trauma and Growth. We've been talking quite a bit in our faculty about this timing for such a time as this, for her being with us, bringing her wisdom and expertise as a trauma psychologist and as a theologian into this space. Last but certainly not least, we also have with us Dr. Jay Pope. Dr. Pope is an associate professor of psychology at Fresno Pacific University. He's also an alum of our program. He's been here faithfully at the Integration Symposium, to my knowledge, for quite some time. I think you are the remnant of folks we can always rely on, whether we have a lot of people or a few people. It's Dr. Pope and his community over at Fresno Pacific who are here faithfully thinking about integration and thinking about its application in undergraduate and graduate settings in the classroom and abroad. He'll say more about what he brings to this space as well. But would you join me in welcoming our panelists? In just a moment, I'm going to ask us to think a little bit about who we are and how what we bring to our space shapes us. But I first want to ask if you all will say a little bit more about yourselves. I don't want to keep speaking for all this time. So first, ask Rosa if you'll just say anything more about who you are, your context, and how that shapes your understanding of trauma before we go into our first question.
Buenas tardes. Good afternoon. Buenas tardes. My name is Rosa Cándida Ramírez. As Dr. Christin said, I am the daughter of Salvadorian immigrants who not only crossed one border, two borders, but three borders to get here to the United States due to a U.S.-backed civil war in El Salvador. So that is something that moving through borders is just a reality that my family has been used to. I also have the privilege of being associate pastor at La Fuente Ministries, a bilingual, intercultural, and intergenerational congregation here in Pasadena, that when we gather together on Sundays, everything from beginning to end is in Spanish and in English, and no language is above the other. And we see God moving in beautiful, beautiful ways there. And I have the privilege of being the associate pastor of spiritual formation there. And on top of that, I am a bivocational pastor. And I am in immigration law at a local nonprofit. I am accredited by the Department of Justice to practice immigration law, and I have the privilege of being ministered to and ministering with alongside immigrants who, quote unquote, want to do things right, but also who also challenge and their faith is able to move mountains in the wake of the realities that they see around them. So I'm very grateful and thankful for being here.
Thank you for being here, Pastora. So grateful. Pastora Inés.
Thank you, Dr. Fort. My name is Inés Velásquez-McBryde, and I think what I would add to my bio is that I'm a third-generation pastor. I'm from Nicaragua, and so my grandfather was a pastor, my father is a pastor, and I'm the first pastora, and it has taken a long time to be able to earn that A next to the word pastor. So as a first-generation immigrant to the United States and as a third-generation pastora, that seasoned experience and life informs how I respond to church trauma and to religious trauma and to the work that I do. I am the lead pastor of the church we hope for. It is a beloved community moved by the Spirit to follow the life, love, and justice of Jesus. It was a church started in the midst of trauma in 2020 during the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, because that's a wonderful time to start a church. And now we've experienced displacement because of the recent urban fires. I've been even learning this month not to call it a wildfire anymore. It's an urban fire, and that has had impact on our church as well. So we are used to pivoting in this church. The most constant thing in the life of this church has been change, and so that too can bring trauma and seasonal trauma to our church. But I'm proud to be the lead pastor. I'm grateful to be there, and I hope to speak from that experience as well.
Thank you so much. Dr. Pannell.
Thank you. My background, I think I feel like I need to start with my dissertation coming out of Fuller, was on children exposed to community violence, post-traumatic stress disorder, and parental monitoring. And that kind of piece, those threads have just gone through my whole career. As I started to work with law enforcement, I worked with LAPD for 23 years and was 18 years as the director of police training. Through some very difficult times, and policing has been changing quite a bit, but for those who sign on to be police officers, we know that we're going to expose you to trauma regularly, whether it's traffic accidents, child abuse, domestic violence, other incidents that occur. And so how do you prepare people to be resilient in a profession where we know that we're going to expose you to trauma regularly, and to be healthy, and to then also generate healthy communities? And so it's been a privilege, but also a very difficult piece to work with. Another important part of my background, I grew up in Canada, so I immigrated here. So after marrying Phil Pannell, and we've had 2 beautiful kids, so I have a mixed race family, and so that has always been an important part of my mission to make sure that public safety is for everyone.
It's beautiful. Thank you for sharing. Dr. Wiebe.
Let's see. I got started in working in areas of trauma, mostly in studying. So during my MDiv and my PhD in theology, focusing on areas of trauma, and started to get, towards the end of my doctoral studies, started to get focused more and more on community trauma and collective trauma. And during those years, the ACEs study was becoming more and more prominent, the Adverse Childhood Experiences study, and was the results of those studies and the kind of ripple effects of that was getting funneled into public spaces, particularly in schools and hospitals. But they weren't going to faith communities, and I was really concerned about that. And so I founded originally the Institute for Congregational Trauma and Growth, and it evolved into Collective Trauma and Growth. But it was first to focus on helping faith leaders to get that information and to figure out how to help their congregants. And in the midst of that work, I was finding it hard to refer to therapists and have them understand the complexities of leaders who were in traumatic circumstances, whether those were from natural disasters, or those were from mass shootings, or those were from internal crises like we've referenced earlier today. And so I became passionate about getting to train up-and-coming therapists into some of those complexities, and that's what led me to get PsyD and eventually get here. So,
Thank you for sharing.
My name is Jay Pope. Yes, as you said, from Fresno Pacific, and we have a group of students up here that we bring every year to study. We've built, I think about 15, 16 years ago, we built a class around this symposium. So they've read the author's works, and it's been a fun time. But I think, in addition, I've been in clinical practice now for the better part of 20 years. And I'm in private practice now, but for 15 years, I was at Link Care Center in Fresno. Some of you may have heard of it. It was probably the first, I'm pretty sure it was the first, counseling center dedicated to primarily working with pastors, missionaries, and NGO workers and their families. And so this was a big part of my clinical experience, and that translated over into some of my research experience as well. I'm a descendant of Armenian genocide survivors, so that's also been a part of my work. And if we ever get to a point today where we're talking about wounds that have not closed, there are some wounds that close and we deal with it that way. Then there are some wounds that just keep on getting opened.
That's right.
And so that's a big part of what I do, working with Armenian pastors in particular.
Thank you so much for sharing. I'm struck by the fact that there's so much about our stories that are not evident to the world unless we share. And as a therapist, so often we find it really important to ask, how do you identify or tell me about yourself? Because your bio or anything else I might find online does not tell me the fullness of any part of who you are. And I think about what it means with you, Dr. Pope, to hear about your descendants, or you being a descendant of Armenian genocide, and all the things wrapped up in your story and intergenerational trauma that I wouldn't know or guess by looking at you. And it reminds me of the significance of choosing to avoid stereotyping and bias in particular ways, and making space to listen fully and completely to as much as we can of people's stories. And so I feel grateful for each of you for what you've shared about the parts of your family life and your background. I want to give a little bit of a preface by talking about how I'm considering trauma for this next hour. Trauma is a word that we use a lot. Clearly, we're talking about it today and tomorrow all day, and there are many different definitions of trauma. I want to use one definition that I think can be helpful by the American Psychological Association, knowing that there are other ways to think about trauma as well. But the APA describes trauma as any disturbing experience that results in significant fear, helplessness, dissociation, confusion, or other disruptive feelings that are intense enough to have a long-lasting negative effect on a person's attitudes, behaviors, or other aspects of functioning. Traumatic events include those caused by human behavior, such as rape, sexual assault more broadly, war, industrial accidents, as well as those traumatic events caused by nature, including earthquakes, tornadoes, floods, and fires. These events often challenge individuals' sense of the world and also our sense of God, I would add, and our sense of safety and predictability. I don't think this definition is necessarily new to us, but I want to use it as a reference because sometimes in colloquial or normal terms we say trauma and we simply mean any kind of pain. And pain is part of the human experience, but all pain is not necessarily traumatic. All pain doesn't have that long-lasting effect that globally impacts your attitudes, your behaviors, your thoughts, your relationships, so many different parts of who you are and how you relate to yourself in the world. So as I think about that definition of trauma and traumatic events from the American Psychological Association's dictionary online, so it's accessible to anyone, to go back and reference that. There's a citation there. I want us to think a little bit about you all and your context, thinking about the traumas that are familiar. Each of you all have alluded a little bit to some of the traumas that are familiar to your contexts and communities, and you have multiple contexts and communities, each of you. But I guess I'd like us to pause and ask what traumas perhaps are some of maybe 2 or 3 traumas that are the most common that you find yourself often engaging with in your congregations or in the academy or in your classrooms, in your clinical practice or training spaces that you're in. What traumas are common and what are some of the most common difficult ways of coping? Some people might call them negative coping, maladaptive coping that you see in that community. We'll start with that. I'm going to actually ask, if you don't mind starting us off, Pastora Rosa. I won't always start with you, but we'll start us off now.
Thank you. One of the things that Dr. Alexia Salvatierra has said is that in these present times, we find ourselves with 2 different fires. We see ourselves with the LA urban fire that has ravaged particularly communities that are very close to us, but also the fire of immigration. And one of the things that I've seen is that outside of the church, many immigrants are reliving what they had originally fled from, which was dictatorships, losing homes because of natural events, or losing families that we saw a couple of years ago due to COVID. And I think outside of the church, it has been something There have been no words to see whether someone has naturalized. It doesn't matter if someone has naturalized, someone has a green card nowadays. There has been so many layers of trauma of whether or not someone belongs in this country, whether or not they did things the right way, whether or not they were able to have the privilege of getting a visa to come to the United States or not, or whether or not they feel that they can go buy groceries safely, or pick their children up from from school, or go to work, or go to the hospital to get checked out. So there's that reality, and I think one of the negative associations that we've seen outside is the stereotype that immigrants are only good for labor, only good for giving, only that is the only way that they're able to belong. But that is not true. They belong because they are made in God's image, and we are all immigrants here to this land, and we recognize that this is Tongva land that we are in. And outside of that, it has been, we've had immigrants. They're the ones who actually helped this community of Pasadena. It was the Pasadena Job Center that during the LA fire, the Altadena fire that we saw just recently, that they helped clean the streets. They helped lead the way. They were not asking for handouts, but yet they were able to lead a community to actually be active and working in their healing, because they themselves have experienced the loss of land, the loss of shelter, the loss of just different realities back in the motherland. And so that's something that we see. But I think within the church, it is complex, because although there are different realities, no one Latino can speak for the plethora of realities of Latinidad in and of itself. But within the church, even those who you worship with, there can be that distinctive idea of, oh, well, they didn't do things right, and yet we're worshiping alongside one another, and not knowing whether the Jesus, that Palestinian Jew, who also embodied the reality of having to migrate and recognize that trauma. That very Jesus understands what many people are experiencing right now in displacement, and that immigrants are not pobrecitos. They're not the people to see as being poor, but they are engineers. There are therapists that are immigrants. There are pastors. There are doctors. There's so much more than what we even give them credit for. And I think one of the harmful things that we can see in our communities is como Dios manda, the idea of however God allows. Instead of allowing ourselves to say, hey, I am an agent of change, I am able to stand there with my fellow immigrant and say, we will not allow this to happen again. And instead we see in the communities around us that, well, it's not for me, it's not me. Someone else can handle that. Or even the compounded fear of trauma of even voicing out realities, what happens to those who do get incarcerated because of speaking out, that we've seen dictatorships in Latin America and abroad. So those are the complexities there of the fear of acting, of being an agent of change and just leaving it in the hands of God and not taking that agency, and also seeing the other side of it of, I'm gonna leave it in the hands of God because it's not for me to deal with. So these are some of the complexities that we see.
Thank you for naming that. That's a theme that hopefully you guys hear as an echo from what we talked about earlier today, of a sense of agency, of knowing what is my place, what is my role, and actually not just receiving whatever has taken place, but being engaged actively in the community. And I also hear you talking about the ways that church members, whether we've immigrated or not, might also perpetuate harm by saying, well, this is the right way to get yourself to the United States, or to Jesus, or to whatever the place might be, right? In the ways that we then perpetuate harm, even in this space that's supposed to be home. It's supposed to be a place of belonging. I appreciate you highlighting that complexity. Yeah. Pastora Inés.
Thank you for sharing all of that, Pastora Rosa. I would say that's some of the top traumas that I have experienced, not only as a lead pastor of our church, but also I was a chaplain here at Fuller Seminary, and I love my students, still do, past and present. I would say that religious trauma is one of the top. I call it church PTSD. I think your field calls it religious trauma. And within that, it's really complex trauma, because within that, what I have found that through religion and through theology, there has been systemic racism, systemic sexism, toxic machismo, toxic patriarchy, systemic homophobia, et cetera, et cetera. And so within that, we have seen all kinds of sources of multiple traumas. And I think what's most painful and heinous is when it's been used in the name of God, like when that trauma has been enacted in the name of God. And so religious trauma, church PTSD, and all those sources is what I have seen the most. And I think you also asked what kind of behaviors we have seen or I have seen. Well, I'll begin with myself so that I can self-implicate in this as well. I don't want to talk about my church as if they're separate and I'm fine. I'm like, my name is Inez, and I am a codependent in recovery. Okay, everyone tracking. I'm a recovering codependent and a recovering pastor in religious trauma. I have suffered from that. And so I have suffered panic attacks because of religious trauma. I have suffered anxiety attacks. And I have suffered some of these things that you listed in my own long-term reaction. I have suffered unpredictable emotions, flashbacks of PTSD because of religious trauma, strained relationships, physical symptoms that for years I did not understand what was happening. And what happens, especially with religious trauma, is that we have lived a Christianity that has disembodied us. And for that, I'm grateful for Fuller that has constantly taught me, even though I went through the school of theology constantly taught me to connect psychology and mental health and to not just pray your anxiety away and not just pray your depression away. And so one of the things that we have done, I think, is to reclaim our bodies and reclaim our voice, because violence renders our voices inarticulate. And so the first thing that we have to do is just to name and say, I have suffered from this trauma. And so it's not as easy as like just reclaiming your theology. To reclaim your theology, you must first reclaim your voice, reclaim your body. It is never a failure to listen to what your body is saying to you. And it's not a failure to say, I have anxiety or I have a panic attack, because something as simple as prayer can trigger, the practices of Christianity, something as ordinary as that can trigger a religious trauma, church PTSD, what I call attack, and maybe that's better name than that. And so that is what was in our gene pool, a spiritual gene pool as a church. I'm grateful for Dr. Dale Ryan. I don't know if he's still teaching at Fuller Seminary. I took 2 classes with him, spiritual formation through the 12-step program. Every pastor should take and go to the 12-step program, pastoral care and abuse. And I'm also grateful for Dr. Jeremy Smoke, who I've never met in person either, who taught theologies of exile. And they taught me how to see how spiritual abuse is the most toxic and the most harmful of all abuses. I didn't believe Dr. Ryan when he said that, but he explained that it is the system that is like Legion, that fosters all kinds of abuse. And so with that, I have tried hard and been very intentional to cultivate a system that is safer. There's no such thing as a safe church. There's no such thing as safe academia. There's no such thing as safe classroom. There's unsafe and safer. Just like the air quality in LA right now. I heard this from an actual person who was teaching about this last week. There's no such thing as safe, but they're safe and safer. So it is with our religious context as well. And so it takes a lot of intentionality and work to actively be anti-spiritually abusive and anti-toxic racism and anti-homophobic, et cetera, et cetera.
It's powerful. That's super powerful. I first want to thank you for implicating yourself before sharing about your congregation or community. It's modeling for us what it means to say, I am connected to us, even if I have a position of leadership or a shepherding role. That is important. I'm a part of that. I also appreciate you reminding us to reclaim voice. It's a theme that also echoes from this morning, talking about our bodies and how disconnected we are as members of the body of Christ from our actual physical bodies, and how significant it is for us to be reconnected to that, and then as a result to each other as well. Thank you. Pastora Inés. Dr. Pannell.
So I'm very humbled to be speaking. I'm not a police officer. I'm a psychologist. I've been working with law enforcement a long time. Certainly have been around it. And one of the things that I will say, Fuller really helped me. master's in theology was in cross-cultural studies. And one of the things I think that has really helped me be able to move in the world of law enforcement as a civilian has been my thinking around law enforcement as a different culture. That I need to learn and understand, what are your traditions? What does that badge mean? What does this mean to you? Why is this significant? And not to come in with assumptions that I know it because I've watched NCIS. A lot. It's really good. Anyway, it's not good. It's not good. We can't solve things that fast. But even as I'm hearing you speak of the different traumas that you're exposed to, the folks that I deal with are in the aftermath of that and in the spaces, and they will go to multiple calls a day. And in the last, and I think what I do want to share, in the last 5 years, law enforcement has gone through enormous changes and challenges, including not being able to recruit people. So when there used to be 10,000 officers in LAPD, I think the number now is much closer to what it was in the 1990s, about 8,800 or so. In Minneapolis, who I've had the opportunity to work with their department, instead of 880 officers, they have closer to 500. So when you're calling 911, you're getting someone who is trying to make up that gap, trying to do all the work and respond in a timely manner. They get judged by response time. And I'm often saying, the quality of your response matters, but when you're feeling the pressure to get to the next call, and each call is kind of things that you've described, it's violence, it's the rates of domestic violence in Los Angeles, approximately 1 in 30 women will be experiencing some kind of intimate partner violence, and the rates of child abuse, things that are happening in our own homes. And then we're asking, honestly, sometimes a 22-year-old who came into law enforcement and had 6 months of training to know how to handle years of family abuse and dysfunction and trauma. And so not that we absolutely have to continue to get better and to give people the tools to deal with it. But often, something else just to let you know about, in the last 5 years, at least when I left LAPD in 2023, roughly 60% of our frontline officers had 5 years on and less. And that is not uncommon with most agencies I'm working with and talking with and consulting with right now. So you have very young officers who weren't even here during Ferguson, during different events. And yet the traumas of community can last generations. And they weren't born when the Rodney King incident occurred. So their experience coming into law enforcement is often very optimistic, and they're trying to be part of a change in the next generation of law enforcement. But one of the things that I've observed in the last 5 years particularly has been the dehumanization of law enforcement officers. They are a part of your community. They probably don't tell you now. They'll say they're an accountant. They'll say they're something else when they're in your church, when they're in their congregation, because it is a lightning rod for so much hurt and trauma that, again, they weren't born at the beginning of some of these traumas, and they are trying to be a part of a change. We have to get better, but it's a continual challenge with cities and resources around training. And I would say I wanted to add a whole extra month to the academy for about 7 years. And it's, you're, especially with low deployment now, people feel like, well, I can't release them to go into, and yet training is a little bit where you get a breath, where you can sit down and go, oh, let me think of this differently. Let me not be on autopilot. So it's the accumulation of trauma. Now, you mentioned some of the behaviors, the things that are very concerning, of course, the rates of alcohol use, and particularly with a younger generation that also at some point in their life went through a couple years of COVID, when they maybe should have been expanding some social skills. And so we are trying to expand the ability for them to deal with the kinds of trauma you're talking about, but they kind of got stunted a few years back, right? And not only for how they deal with other people's trauma, but their own. And so alcohol is, a sanctioned release, and that's why we talk about 12 steps in society, and yet it's really pushing down the trauma that they're exposed to. The other thing that we see is really a high rate of suicide in law enforcement. And so when you can't, and it used to be, I think this is a small trend. I can't say for sure that this is a national trend, but I have seen more younger people committing suicide. It used to be in law enforcement that was something, right around you're midway through your career and there's a crisis of either relationship or other things happening. So it's a little bit surprising when somebody has 2 and 3 years on and now they're committing suicide, and the ripple effect, the echo, if you will, of that trauma also on that community. So certainly the most maladaptive ways that can come out. I do want to emphasize there's an effort for us to be talking about post-traumatic growth and post-traumatic, not to mitigate the trauma they've been exposed to, but also to help them expand and recognize the resilience that they have already demonstrated and how we can weave that into a day-to-day resilience, that it doesn't have to be quite so dire on the outset.
Thank you for sharing. It feels very weighty and sobering to me on so many levels. I think anytime law enforcement is mentioned, it feels weighty to me. I think especially thinking about the weight that an individual carries, especially at such a young age. I think about 22, 24, 26, something like that, entering the police force in particular. And I think about what it means to be an individual who has maybe some really good equipping, but not maybe sufficient equipping, right? They're just at the beginning of entering into a field, and the need for a whole system around them to uphold them, to debrief with them, to process with them, all of those things. And entering into a community, like you mentioned, that is marked by its own story. And especially if those stories, particular communities, are marked by generational trauma, and you walk into generational trauma that predates you, what that means and what that looks like, and what responsibility means, where hope lies, if there is any hope, which often is correlated with suicidality. If you can't find hope and don't have enough social support, it's hard to keep going. Yeah.
One thing I just would also like to bring up, most police departments now, their officers are equipped with body camera. And I just want you to rethink where you were at 22 and 23, and if you would want to be wearing a body camera every single interaction that you have, some things that you wish you could have taken back, but and that also dynamic has changed within the whole profession in a very significant way, for some good outcomes as well, and so we want to embrace that and pull from that, but also just another level of weight and responsibility that most professions don't have.
Yeah, it's an important thing to be thinking about. I appreciate you naming some of those factors. Dr. Wiebe.
Yeah, I would say the two ways that I encountered responses to trauma the most are either in response to a collective trauma like a natural disaster or a mass shooting, where the leader that I'm talking to is basically like, I didn't sign up for this. And that processing of not only what has happened, but like the dream has died. That whatever program we were, launching into, or the whole reason I went to seminary, or all those different things. So it's a lot of helping someone process their vocational losses. And that sense of inadequacy and that sense of like, I didn't, they didn't teach me in this in seminary. Or in my private practice, I work a lot with either Christian business leaders, pastors, missionaries, or their families. And the other thing I get a lot is basically like, I haven't had trauma, which is like, I'm in here because I've got this weird, like, I can't stop my panic attacks and I can't stop my anger issues, but I haven't had trauma, or, God has been really good to me, and but there's this, they're coming from churches that we didn't have language for it. It wasn't allowed. If you were a good Christian, you had your best foot forward. You felt good. You forgive and forget, all those kinds of things. And so a lot of my work has been helping people to process that they actually have experienced trauma, and these are the multi-layers of those losses.
I appreciate you mentioning especially this, like, I haven't experienced trauma. I think that's many people's story. Like, I didn't know that was a trauma. Like, I remember going to therapy for the first time, and I remember my therapist saying to me, you know, Christin, no child in elementary school sort of had that particular experience you're describing. And I remember looking at him and being like, what are you talking about? Like, I really couldn't process the depth of pain that he was reflecting back to me about that part of my story. And I was like, no, it wasn't that bad, because that was my norm. That was what was familiar to me. And it is striking for someone to reflect back, this is normative, but it isn't right. And that is a really big deal, to have someone kind of make that, clarify that to you. Do you want to say something about that?
Yeah. Just I had a gentleman around 60 who said to me, I haven't really ever grieved anything. Like, I haven't had anything to grieve. And I thought, wow. And we sort of walked through, like, you haven't had any losses? Like, that's amazing. So yeah, there's just those, I think in many ways it's a protective barrier, of course, and has been useful. And I think we as church leaders can be helping to create spaces where we can normalize what is actually happening.
That's right. Normalize what is, so that people know you're not alone. And then also, hopefully, eventually normalize what should be, like this, or what could be, perhaps is a better word. Shoulds have a lot of weight. Shoulding on yourself is not particularly helpful. But what does it mean then to know also what could be too? Yeah. And thinking about just all the process grief stands out to me as well. Even the grief of what you hoped for in a vocation, whether you're joining the police force and thinking, I hoped I could be a member of this community and serve and protect, like the letters on my car say. And then I'm not perceived that way, or that's not my experience of this, and all the complexity that comes with that for any vocation.
Yeah, I would just add that that's the other question I get the most is, you say processing trauma, what is it? Like, how do I process it? And so a lot of the work is walking through, what does it mean to actually process? And a lot of people think it's some sort of intellectual activity versus an embodied and spiritual activity, that we're metabolizing these experiences.
That's right. We move through life so quickly that processing is really difficult. Metabolizing doesn't happen the same way. We don't sleep as much, so physically metabolizing doesn't happen the same way it's supposed to, right? We eat on the go, in the car, in LA traffic, so you're stressed as you're eating, and so your body doesn't digest the way it's supposed to for food, let alone traumatic experiences. And just the cumulative effect in one body is a lot. Thank you for sharing. Yes, also Dr. Paul.
Well, I was thinking about what I was going to say, but I've just got caught up in what Dr. Wiebe was saying about naming these things. It never ceases to amaze me how many times as a therapist I have to remind myself that even for me, who's been trained in this kind of thing, it's a struggle to have to successfully name what it is that I'm feeling when it's happening, and then to have to remember that I'm seeing people that have received no training in how to do this. Maybe they've read a book or two or talked with a few people. So I'm constantly having to slow down. And against their wishes, which is to move on as quickly as possible. And I can't tell you how many times as a counselor I've had to tell people, no, I just want to stare at this for a while. Can we just stop and look at this? Can we maybe even write it down on a piece of paper? This happened. This is what you're going through. Oh, okay. If you feel like it's important, yes. It's pretty important. Two things in response to the original question. I think one of them is just having maintain. I don't attend an Armenian church, but I attend. There's my regular church, and then I relate closely to several Armenian churches, and just the growing awareness of. There's some people who watch the news in order to stay informed, and there are some people who have to watch the news because they have to watch the news because their lives could change in an instant based on the latest policy, the latest announcement, the latest thing. And then not only their lives can change here, but their lives can change in the countries where they came from, where there are major significant impacts. So just on a daily basis. And so when we talk about PTSD and this kind of thing, we often talk about hypervigilance as if it is a an irrational response, an understandable but nevertheless irrational response to something that's happened. You are demonstrating hypervigilance in situations that don't require it. But for a lot of people, it is a required hypervigilance because the consequences are very real. So just a growing awareness of that. I think, secondly, and I'm seeing this more in my regular counseling sessions, a growing population of, whether we call it people who identify as post-evangelical or people who are deconstructing or spiritual nomads, but finding that therapy is really one of the only places where this kind of thing can be talked about. A whole generation of people who grew up heavily influenced by the evangelical movement, who had adults invest heavily in their lives when they were growing up. When Dr. Brambo this morning was talking about her appreciation for the Bible that she got from that tradition. And these are communities that people were a part of and they were thriving in and they were enjoying, and then at somewhere along the line they felt very betrayed. Yeah. And they're looking for a home. Their hearts need community. They're desperate for community, but they can't go back to the churches where maybe they were raised, or churches like where they were raised. So just discovering these people little by little in counseling, hurting people who are looking for community but don't feel like they have a place to go. And strangely, they end up talking to me and people like me, and I'm one of those people, so that's another part of that.
That's right. That's right. I resonate with that last sentence, I'm one of those people. I think that's really deep to think about. I think about the idea of like the wounded healer. I don't think there is such a thing as a healer that isn't wounded. You might not be aware, back to the question of some of your patients or some of the people you're consulting with, Dr. Wiebe, about like, I didn't know I experienced these things, but we have experienced many things, often unnamed, to your point. And it takes time to digest. I think with that being said, I want to use that as a moment to allow us to tap back into some digesting that we need to do as we're here. I want to ask you to take a moment and just to think. We've heard a lot of stories from these 5 panelists just in the last 20, 30 minutes. I want you to think about whatever is kind of bubbling up for you. Be like, I keep going back to what Pastora Rosa said about this, or what Dr. Pannell is saying about this. And I'm curious if there's a question that comes to you. We have here on the slide the number that we're going to use in a few moments to actually entertain the questions of those of us here in the room and those of us who are joining us online. And our hope is to make these stories relevant to us. Dr. Strawn often talks about embodiment, thinking about how important the body is. And I want us to be mindful the body always exists in one place and one time, at least as far as I know. Maybe sci-fi has some other things to say about where the body is, but it seems like the body is in one place at one time. And so right now, in this moment, I'm going to ask you all to think about what's a question that stirred up in you that you might want us to be able to talk about together as a panel. What we can reflect on that might have some relevance to your community, to your culture, to your congregation, to your clinical practice. So give us just a moment. I'm actually going to pause right here for about 30 seconds. We think about a question, and if you want to type it in, I'm going to open this iPad in just a few minutes to see what you all have been typing. And I'm mindful sometimes it's just the fastest processors get their questions asked. And I'm a fast processor. You maybe can tell that by how fast I speak. But that's a privilege, and I want to acknowledge everyone doesn't process quickly, and you don't need to. So if you take a moment, think about what you want to type out before I ask one more question of our panelists, and then we'll come to the questions that you all have. So 30 seconds to process for a bit. As you all continue to process, digest, love seeing the questions come in. Thank you for engaging actively with me here. I want to ask our panelists one more question. I am mindful that there are difficult or maladaptive coping mechanisms that many of us experience. Minimizing, for instance, is one of them, like that wasn't that big of a deal, right? Or ignoring certain things, or becoming hypervigilant, right, after having a traumatic experience. That's a natural, immediate response, but becomes maladaptive over time in many contexts. But I'm curious about some of the forms of coping that you feel proud of, that you see either in yourself, if you want to disclose about your own stories, as we talked about being implicated in our communities, but also maybe of your clients or of your congregations or people you've consulted with, of like, I feel really proud When I see this community after this training or after this conversation, after this session, after this moment that we've had in our congregation of lamenting, whatever it might be, like responding in these healthy ways. It doesn't have to be that they're doing that all the time, but I want us to also highlight some of those things that we feel like we are leaning in, and we'll keep leaning in this way. So we'll give us a moment, and then I'm going to start in the opposite direction. Dr. Pope, you don't always go last, so I'm going to ask, we'll go this way. Just some things, adaptive forms of coping to trauma that you have noticed and been like, that is beautiful. We want to continue to affirm that, uphold that, and maybe recommend that to us who might need those coping mechanisms as well.
Well, it's in keeping with the theme of the work that I've been doing with pastors, and particularly Armenian pastors. There's a built-in advantage, and that is that Armenians are always getting together and eating. And there's after church celebrations. And there's one church in Fresno that I attend periodically, and I don't ever eat before I go because I know there's going to be some sort of celebration that I'll be invited to afterwards, and it always happens. But there is a strong built-in expectation in the Armenian community that you're going to be showing up to church, that you're going to be participating in. So as people have become more aware of the need to have to talk about things, there's just greater exposure. And so there's such a deep-seated commitment to attending, because so much of part of that Armenian identity is to attend a church. And so so just the practice of getting together is one that jumps out immediately to me, is just people who are willing to commit to a process of showing up, even when they may not feel like it or they don't want to, that there's a loyalty and a commitment, which is interesting because we're also talking about people who've been betrayed, who don't feel safe. And there seems to be a bit of a dichotomy there, but people who nevertheless show this toughness, a desire to stick it out, a desire to keep on showing up. They may not exactly like it or feel totally safe. Those people that leave church early before there's a chance to fellowship afterwards. Like, I still think I kind of like this thing. And so there's a commitment to show up and to hear what people might have to say. There's a hunger. And so in that sense, I want to honor the people that continue to endeavor and try to be around people who are wanting to help.
Yeah, I think part of what I hear in that is, for many of us, commitment is costly.
Yes.
It's not just like, oh, it's easy to show up. Some people keep going to church because it is really easy. It's actually easier to go than it is to leave. That's its own discernment process for some of us about where we need to be for church and all that. But I also think it's important to honor, right? That just because someone shows up day after day or week after week doesn't mean it's always easy. And it is a beautiful thing to affirm as we are able to actually to keep showing up, and also to watch that transformation in the community over time. That's incredible. And also, that is my experience, my limited experience of Armenian communities is food, and I am delighted to be welcomed in for all of the hospitality I've received. It's beautiful. Dr. Wiebe.
Yeah, I would say that one of the significant shifts that has happened over the last 15 years is there used to be a focus on deploying, and so sort of parachuting in, right? The experts would come in and tell you how to heal. And what the studies have actually shown is that when communities can be in touch with each other after a community trauma, that they will naturally create healing amongst themselves. And it's not that they don't need people to come in. They need a sense of being seen and being appreciated in their pain, but they also need some uninterrupted space to create their own solutions, and that those tend to be the most lasting kinds of solutions.
That's beautiful. It reminds me of something I've said to clients before, is my desire is to work myself out of a job. I love seeing my clients. I love doing long-term psychoanalytically oriented work, and I'm here for it, 5 years, 10 years, 15, let's do it. But I don't want you to need to have to be here, because I'm your only space where you feel safe enough to process these things. It is amazing to take what you've learned in a safer or safe space and then to create those safe spaces in a part of your congregation, in a part of your neighborhood, in some other space. And I hear that, saying that can be done. We can do that. That's our hope. That's beautiful. Dr. Pannell.
I'm going through like a catalog in my head of different things, but I would say one thing within law enforcement that I've noticed has changed so dramatically. When I first started in 2000 and I'd walk into a roll call room and talk about emotional intelligence, you would have thought I had 6 heads. And they're like, oh no, this is not a thing. And I'm so grateful for just the trendiness of emotional intelligence, if nothing else, because it allows me to go, why wouldn't we be smart about emotion? And let's talk about it. And the framework of that profession for so long, which also I think became our vulnerability, which was that we can't talk about emotion. And I remember having a client who just had no language for his experience. And at 15 years on, could not describe what was going on for him, but then trying to, many of the things that you've mentioned. And so then seeing over, in the course that I'm running now in Chicago, being able to talk to people and say, who has an awareness of emotional intelligence, and 70% of the room puts their hand up, whereas years ago it would have been 0. And to feel like it's become more acceptable to start talking, and that for example, in Chicago, they used to have one poor social worker, I think, for 13,000 officers. So yeah, there you go. There's an empathetic sigh, right? I'm just like, what an impossible. And in the last couple years with a new chief coming in, they now have 19, which is a little bit more appropriate, and they're getting involved in different things like training, but how do you change these systems that weren't designed for that? It was like, you're just supposed to do X. And so seeing that growth and the openness to, we need to have better mechanisms, and people moving toward that vulnerability, which often hasn't been engaged, but it's interesting, that discussion around, there is no courage without vulnerability. And so how do we tell you to have courage, but never be vulnerable? That's just not going to happen. So embracing both sides of that, and having conversations about that, and seeing them go, this is awkward, this feels difficult, but leaning into it. So lastly, I would just say, with the course that we're doing in Chicago, we have them do capstone projects in their communities. And because it's a week a month for 5 months, so every week they go back and they're trying to work. And so whenever we see their capstones and we go, you have to have a community component. You have to have stakeholders, like, go back. So they go back. And then just their own delight and joy to not be alone. And I think to feel like people are engaging again and saying, yes, we want better solutions, and how do we do this collectively? And so, while it hurts to be broken, it also makes us reach for solutions maybe we wouldn't have done before. And so that makes me very proud to see that stretch and that engagement, both on the community side and the law enforcement side.
It's beautiful on so many levels, watching a holistic change, not just the individual, but the whole system around it. Slow and steady wins the race, hopefully. Thank you for sharing that.
I think of a couple of things. First, the ability to question and interrogate is something that we normalize in our church, especially with religious trauma, church PTSD of shame, and PTSD of guilt, of just don't question the Bible, don't question God, don't question your suffering, don't question your pain. The ability to question and to normalize that and to be curious is something that has to be intentional. I don't tell people what to think. I'd like to encourage people how to think. And that's something that was a gift to me from seminary. And I thank Dr. Love Seacrest, my interpretive practice professor, who never gave me an answer to my questions. She would say, what do you think, Inés? So often when people have questions about the Bible, especially when it has been weaponized against them and on the basis of race, gender, ethnicity, sexual orientation, we welcome the questioning and the interrogation. When I think about my class with Dr. Smoke, the theologies of exile, the beautiful way that he superimposed church PTSD of shame and guilt onto the prophets, it just completely broke my paradigm. And I know that this could feel scandalous to question, but we were basically putting putting the prophets on the chair and diagnosing them. Like, did God really say this, or is this your trauma speaking? That's that can change a whole theology, you know? And so to be able to like question even the words in the Bible, like through exilic or post-exilic stories, to go, that might have been their trauma speaking. Because trauma changes the way we see God, the way we see ourselves. Thank you for the two sisters over here who are nodding and saying yes. The way we see ourselves, especially if you're a woman of color, or a non-straight, non-heterosexual, the way we have been spoken to about how to think about God. So the ability to question is very freeing for me as a pastor, to say, I don't have all the answers. What do you think? You know, because where you stand changes what you see, depending on your orientation, gender, race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, immigrant status. And so the ability to question is very important for us in our church, especially when we're questioning a theology that has been weaponized against us. And the ability to welcome mystery, to welcome uncertainty, and what I like to call, super fancy word, I don't know theology. I don't know. And some things I will never know. And I came from a post-evangelical world that was so certain. I think the opposite of faith. Kevin, you taught me this, my fellow brother. Say it again. The opposite of faith is certainty. Is certainty. So then we welcome uncertainty in our church. We welcome uncertainty, we'll welcome mystery, we'll welcome questioning, we'll welcome interrogation. And that's the second thing, real quick. See, that was 4 things in one. I'm a preacher, so you gave a preacher a mic. The second thing is connected to what you say, Dr. Pope, a good theology of food. We're a multi-ethnic community. And the most beautiful and most disruptive sacrament in our church is the communion table. And it's not just about crackers and grape juice. We received a grant last year from the Calvin Institute of Worship to rethink and disobey the lectionary. And that was so funny when I thought about how let us disobey the lectionary, and to flip the communion table. And so we welcomed all the multi-ethnic communities to give us an expression of communion. So to experience Kamayan feast from the Filipino worldview, to experience Chinese Lunar New Year, to experience making lumpias, to experience making dumplings, and to center those rituals from those communities, that was a sacrament. That was rich, non-Western, and just blew my mind. So a good theology of food is not just about eating. But thank you, Julie Tai, for reminding me that it's not just food, but it's the memory connected to that food. And it's a theology of food. And so being reimaginative in the practices, especially for a community that has been wounded from religious trauma, and centering those rituals and images from our communities reminds me that we do have a strength-based model that doesn't have to center the trauma only. But that we bring from our communities gifts and contributions that are non-Western to our new ideas of church. And food has been one of those conduits that I did not expect to give us so much theology and connective tissue.
So good. Theology of food. I feel so struck by the fact that food and wine are one of the few things we know exists in the new heaven and the new earth. So whatever that means about appreciating the body now and preparing for the future, it's a beautiful invitation for us. Last but not least.
Thank you. I think one of the gifts that my community has had is the ability to feel. At La Fuente, we have worked really, really, really hard. I am a pastor. I know, I 100% know I am not a therapist. I, too, am a recovering codependent. And I am thankful that I have a co-pastor, Pastor Marcos, who also recognizes he is not a therapist. He is married to one, but he is himself. We're not therapists. We don't have the answers. Go to therapy. That is something that we encourage over and over and over again. But even for those in the congregation who are not ready, I am thankful that we have had moments in the last couple of years to pause, to reflect, and to have communal lectio divina, to decentralize the pastoral, not just the pastoral position, where where the liturgy is of the people, where it is the people who is actually creating their prayers, who are writing songs. And also thank you to the Calvin Institute of Christian Worship. We had a grant last year as well, where we were able to have people who said, no, I can never write. Who wrote beautiful songs bilingually that talked about mental health, that talked about having different abilities, that talked about, and also being in the spectrum. When do we hear about that in worship? When do our prayers reflect that? And bilingually as well. We don't see that. And so I am so proud of the hard work. And if it wasn't for, it was because we were able to get to the place that we were because the preaching moment reflected that. And I want to speak to all the pastors. It is your role, it is your responsibility to be able to partner with therapists around you, with counselors, people who are trained, and for you to know your limits too. To know that you might not have all the answers. So I am thankful that I don't do the work by myself. I'm so thankful that I connect with others around me, that I'm able to also say, you know what, this is a marathon, you go for it. I need a breath, and to also be honest. I am thankful that I have a community that I can be honest with. I am a pastor, yes, but I can tell them, I can't. That's right. I can't. That's right. Like, con la fuerza de Dios, with God's strength, yes, but God is asking me to sit and wait this out. And that is a hard lesson. That is a very hard thing to do, especially as the eldest daughter. Yes. Eldest daughter, yes, all those eldest daughters, you know. But I am so thankful that in the worship moments, we have had that ability to be able to sit and to have the people in the congregation ask the questions, but also have the ability to feel. Because of what we did in the project was called Worship del Pueblo de Dios. It is worship of the people of God. Because of what happened, the thing that actually helped us get into that place was talking about our emotions and how God actually made us feel. Right. And to many people, and they were in awe of, what? What? Oh, when are you going to actually preach? When are we actually going to sit with the word, right? But that actually led to different points of vulnerability within the service where we actually had congregants, members of the congregation, give their tears to God. Have God hold on to their tears, but also recognize the tears that they were holding during the worship service. And it's just not a happy, clappy moment, because that's not what church is about. Of us coming together and recognizing, God, we need you. We need you. So it was those moments that helped. But also, I'm so proud that we have then been able to go to art, not just to physical art. This last summer, we had what we called the community art project. And it was because of the vulnerability that happened with our other project, our other grant, that led to the willingness to participate for the congregation. The art that was created was a sun, and it's a purple sun that was going to be showcased during Advent, and it had the theological meaning, but every single part of that sun had a either used piece of paper that was purple. Every person in the congregation had that represented as their prayers, and they placed it on the sun. Little did they know that if you rearrange that sun in Lent, that piece of art is going to be a cross. That God is able to have every single person's prayers, their tears was in that. And that is actually one of the very few pieces that one of the members in our congregation who lost everything, they saved that piece of art. That in the Eaton fire. And so that piece of art is a before and after of what has happened. And it is a recognition that Emmanuel, God with us, has been with us before and will continue to be with us going forward as we have been, and we recognize that we are created to feel. And I do recognize the nuance that it's not always safe to do so, but I am thankful that we have worked hard and for years that many people who never thought they would go to therapy, because that's not of God, are finally going to therapy or recognizing that they need help. And so I want to encourage you, pastors, keep doing the good work, but also let us hold on to the community that is around us and recognize that together we can lead one another into God's presence in very whole ways.
So good. It's so good. I'm struck by the freedom that comes from acknowledging that we're limited or finite that you're talking about, from actually being a pastora who says, I cannot, which I don't hear very many pastors, period, ever say that they can't do something. but it is acknowledging that we are made in the image of God as finite creatures. To say, I reached my limit. I cannot do this anymore, actually. Someone else needs to tap into this journey. And that's a beautiful thing to be reminded of, the community around us, holding up those things. There's so many good questions that have come in, and we have a few more moments to entertain them. So I'm going to weave a few of them together. Some of the themes that are emerging from the questions have to do with how you all hold the weights that you hold, as those who are caring for caregivers, or those who are carrying the weights of other people in your sessions. So I am curious if you all could talk about specifically something that is perhaps any practice, or something that is practical that you do that helps you all to hold the many things that you hold, especially when they're the stories of trauma. As you think about this, I want to acknowledge for us here in the room, many of us are aware that vicarious trauma or secondary trauma is a thing, where you're not the one who experienced the direct impact of violence or some other type of horrifying reality, but you then hold the story of the person who experienced it. Or you come and you enter the scene, and so you weren't directly affected, but the indirect effect is very real and should never be minimized. And that really affects caregivers in particular, or helping professionals, as all of you all are in various ways. So what is something that helps you all, as those who might be prone towards compassion fatigue, being overwhelmed by all the heavy stories? What keeps you grounded in your ministry and in your clinical practice and consulting? You guys can popcorn.
For me, a rule of life, again, something that was introduced here at Fuller, a rule of life is like a trellis that can sustain your calling and can hold you up, just like a trellis that holds up the grapevine so that it's not just sitting on the ground. It picks it up so that you can have room to breathe, space for the light to come in. And so I have a rule of life for every season, and I have a rule of life for when crisis hits. And so that when crisis hits, you don't go, oh no, what am I going to do? You already have a trellis that you can go to sustain you. And within that, there's bold boundaries, restorative rest, Sabbath, and play. I think that's especially important as a recovering codependent, to not cultivate a codependent church, that we know everything or do everything or answer every question or are always there. That's inhuman. The expectations that I have of myself can be inhuman, and the expectations that others can have of myself are also inhuman. And also, I am more than my work, so play is very important. And also, I go to therapy, and I have a spiritual director that's trauma-informed, because I'm extra. I need 2 people to help me every month, and so, yeah.
That's beautiful. Thank you for sharing. Other folks?
I think it's helpful to do something that is kind of the opposite of what you are normally doing in your working life. So I know several professors here at Fuller are clinical practitioners, but then they also are teachers. That they do get a portion of their day is actually spent speaking in ways that they don't do a lot of in practicing. And so that's built into my schedule, which is very helpful. And so it probably spares my family a lot of, just a lot of things that you feel like saying at the end of the day, but just it could be therapy, it could be even if you're teaching a class, or just something that gives you the opportunity to actually express yourself. As a lot of helpers are actually discouraged from expressing themselves. They're waiting around for other people to express themselves, and then you're supposed to respond, but you need to express yourself too.
That's right. That's good.
My first thought when you said that, my immediate thought was breathe. Breathe. Because if you know me, I'm generally on the move. This is the longest I've sat in about 6 months, so it's really hard. So I like to be moving, but I think sometimes that's also my deflection. That's my way of not being still. And so being a lot more intentional about breathing. And this year is my 10-year anniversary of losing my husband to cancer. And so while working in law enforcement, my husband had a 7.5-year journey with cancer. And I remember just sort of the challenge of, like, I teach about resilience. I better do the stuff I tell everybody else to do. So just starting with that breath, and then sometimes I think there are no words for prayers. sometimes there's just not words for it. And so that breathing in and breathing out, there was somewhere where I heard that it's actually the sound of Yahweh. That when you're breathing in and breathing out, and I thought, okay, well, Lord, you know what that prayer is. And so I guess it sounds almost too simple, but just sometimes just the piece of taking that moment to breathe and stop and be still, which is not my natural state.
You're not alone. Thank you for naming that.
Yeah, I would echo all that has been said. I would add in daily stretching. I do a lot of that, and just trying to, get the blood flowing. Let the nonverbal things kind of move around. And I also started years ago having some intentional relationships that aren't only therapy, but that are people who have been walking alongside me and know and can pick up from kind of where we left off about what my work is or what my home life is, and to be able to kind of be a sounding board or an accountability partner. And those have been very intentionally, like, would you do this with me, kinds of things. And the other thing, which is, I'm moving out of the season of this, but when my kids were younger, I also needed to kind of carve out some space, and so actually started making dinner starting at like 4:30 and just deciding, putting the phone down, and for the next 2 hours, I'm going to make a real slow dinner, and the kids are going to be around me, and they're going to be participating, and we're going to put some good music on, and that's when I'm going to hear about the day, and I'm also going to be like doing this embodied work of creating the meal and them being a part of it. And that became a really important part of healing as I'm doing the work I'm doing. So.
I have one more thing I should add, just because I'm feeling like I was maybe too spiritual on the last one. But the truth is, in the last couple weeks, I did learn a TikTok video. Little Bruno Mars and Rosé. So, not for public display, as I've been told, and my son actually said never admit it, but then here we are. But I do feel like, back to your point about play and fun, is to push ourselves to do things that, I don't know, why couldn't I? Why couldn't I?
I'll add to the TikTok trend. Not that I dance, no, but I've actually asked my partner to put a timer on. So just doom scrolling. That's something that around me that can you help me? Like just being honest of I'm addicted to doom scrolling, and just being honest of I feel the need to get all the information, which we had talked about earlier, of needing to know everything so that I don't lose myself in all that's happening, and yet also being honest. And I think that's something that's been helpful, not only friends, but also giving them permission. Call me out if you're seeing X, Y, and Z in me. So having friends that are very honest and loving, even when I am probably a grouchy version of myself, they see. I'd also, I think, add to that list, therapy as a spiritual practice has been very, very grounding and very, very helpful. So I am thankful for my therapists, and also the therapists that I've had in the last decade plus of my therapy journey, and my spiritual director. I was like laughing. I was like, yeah, spiritual director, therapist. And I'm gonna out myself here. I haven't told many of my friends, but I've been experimenting with gluten-free cooking, so that's something that I am thankful. Mostly because sometimes it's not nice. It doesn't come out good. So, but yes, those who know. But yes, I've experimented with cooking, so in different ways. So I appreciate that, and stretching as well has been something that I've tried to incorporate lately. So.
It's amazing. I'll make this a final thought for us, and then Dr. Strawn will come and transition us. But one of the things I hear from you all is the importance of space for play and laughter space for your kids to play around you back when they were little, space for you to play and for your kids to laugh at you, perhaps, with what might happen with TikTok, and space for tears as well, space for grief, that a part of being whole is making space for all of our emotions, which is so powerful and so important. This is a sobering verse, but I just want to read it because you were talking about tears earlier, and there not being space for tears. They're not people not knowing they had anything to grieve, especially those in ministry. And there's a verse that I stumbled upon in the Psalms. I've read it many, many times. It just never stood out to me until a year or two ago. But Psalm 56, verse 8. And it's simply acknowledging Jesus, or God in general, being a witness to our grief. And Psalm 56, verse 8 reads, "You keep track of all of my sorrows. You have collected all of my tears in your bottle. You have recorded each one in your book." I find that so precious to imagine the Lord being very mindful of that happened, and I don't want you to forget, and I will not forget. This happened. Though there is redemption, there is grace, there is resurrection, there is remembering of pain and sorrow. I love remembering if God will keep track of my tears, then I can keep track of my tears. I can remember those tearful things too. My friends who are safe can be witnesses with me of those things. I hope there is freedom for you all remembering in the text there is room for all of those emotions, the joy and laughter, as well as the pain and grief that comes with trauma and our process of healing. With that, will you thank our panelists as Dr. Strong comes up?
We're going to transition now to a 15-minute break. How many minutes? 15. So we're going to be back here at 5 after to hear Dr. Shelley Rambo again. There are some snacks out on the patio, so please feel free to enjoy those. The restrooms, the codes are there. Thank you again, panel, and we'll see you in 15 minutes.